What's going on, everybody? My name is Jordan Fowler, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the pros and cons of shooting wedding videos either handheld or using a gimbal. So let's get into it. So on New Year's Eve of 2020, I shot my first fully handheld wedding. I've obviously used handheld techniques before within my wedding videos, typically towards the end in the evening with the reception, and I dropped the frame rate down to 24 frames per second and everything's a bit more fast paced. But I shot the entire wedding handheld, and I'll show you some of the clips up now. I think it came out really nicely. I managed to get some really smooth, nice shots. I've been practicing my technique quite a lot for shooting handheld, and I think this came out really well. But in this video, we're going to look at the pros and cons of shooting handheld and shooting with a gimbal at a wedding, and which one's best, and whether or not I will be making the switch to shooting all of my future weddings handheld. So whether you decide to shoot handheld or whether you choose to shoot with a gimbal, these are both skills that both require a lot of practice to actually master. And I don't think one is outright better than the other, but they both have their uses, and it's knowing when to use them that is the real trick. When you start to break down the actual camera movements that you can achieve with shooting handheld or with a gimbal, these are both very similar. When you're shooting handheld, you obviously have total free reign over the camera. Wherever you point it, it's going to shoot, and you can snap from a pan to a tilt to whatever very quickly. With a gimbal, sometimes you can be limited between changing between these different types of movements, because it sometimes locks off different axes of the gimbal depending on how you've got it set up. I personally feel like you can pull off harder moves using a gimbal, such as parallaxes and arcs. I feel like these moves are quite difficult to do handheld and get really smooth shots, so using a gimbal for these kind of things is definitely my go-to. So one small myth that I would like to stamp out straight away is that just by putting your camera on a gimbal you're going to get perfectly buttery smooth shots every single time. That is just not the case. When you compare the setup time of shooting handheld or shooting with a gimbal side by side, for me the handheld wins every time. The gimbal you have to set up before you even get there. Your gimbal has to be charged. Then you have to balance your camera on the gimbal. You have to make sure that you're not putting too much strain on any of the motors, so you have to make sure that the camera is perfectly balanced. And then coming back to it, any time that you want to change focal length or change lens, you have to then rebalance your gimbal. Attaching accessories to your gimbal can also be limited by the payload that your gimbal can support. For example, if you want to put an external monitor on the top like the Ninja 5 or a Rode microphone, then you can actually be limited, as the gimbal might not support that amount of weight time you've got your camera and a big lens on there as well. Now don't get me wrong, some handheld setups like my own can be pretty heavy after you're using them for a long period of time, but if you have to add a gimbal to that mix as well, you're really adding a lot of weight, and if you're going to be shooting, say, a wedding all day long, you're really going to feel that on your arms. What lens you're going to be using and the focal length you plan to be using it at is really another deciding factor on whether you shoot that scene with handheld or with a gimbal. If you're shooting anything really that's 70, 85mm upwards, any tiny bit of shake at your end is going to be making that footage look really shaky. So shooting handheld for something at those kind of focal lengths might not always be the best option. However, if you're shooting, say, 24mm or wider, say a wide angle lens like a 14mm, I sometimes use this sort of focal length for establishing venue shots when I'm at a wedding. Now these kind of focal lengths are a lot more forgiving when you're shooting handheld, because you're not going to notice as much shake in there, especially if you're using a good lens with built-in image stabilization. And if you're shooting in 60 or 120 frames per second and you slow that down in your editing software, that's really going to make for some really nice, smooth, buttery footage. The biggest factor when choosing whether to shoot a certain scene handheld or with a gimbal is just looking at what the situation is and what the actual scene is in itself. If it's a real important moment, or if it's quite a long scene, like at a wedding, if it's exchanging the rings or the vows or the bride walking down the aisle, these are typically shots that you're going to want to extend for a longer duration, so you need them to be smoother, and they're quite emotional and magical moments in a wedding video, so you need those to really be smooth and the viewer not to be distracted by any shaky footage. However, when it comes to the evening reception and the party and the sparklers and everything that's going on, I always like to switch over to shooting handheld then, because I feel like it creates more of a realistic and a faster paced vibe, especially at 24 frames per second, and you really catch the action and you can get a lot closer and you're a lot more unobtrusive to people than you are walking around with a massive gimbal. Now, something which can really help footage which is pretty smooth but not perfect is when you get it back in your editing software and you're using something like Warp Stabilizer within Premiere Pro. Now, this can really smooth down a piece of footage, but it is not by any means going to save a really shaky bit of footage. You can't hang out the window of a car shooting handheld really shaky, slap some Warp Stabilizer on it and it'd be perfect. It's just not going to happen. In a lot of cases, it may actually make it look worse, and it adds a sort of weird movement effect which you really don't want, and it is easy to spot when someone has done that in a video. However, if you use Warp Stabilizer on a shot which has been filmed at, say, 60 frames per second on a gimbal which is already smooth, and then you slow that down and you add some Warp Stabilizer to it, you can get a shot which looks like it's been filmed on like a jib, and it is perfectly smooth. To sum up, I think you have to break down what is most important to you at the time. If it's the type of movement you're trying to get, if it's a parallax or a more complex move, you might want to go for the gimbal. However, if it's just a dolly in or a dolly out or a pan to the left or right, you might get away with just shooting handheld. So that is really down to you and how you feel most comfortable using that technique of filming. You also have to consider the type of shot that you're getting. If you're getting a really fast paced and a upbeat part of the video, then maybe shoot handheld. Maybe if you're going to edit it a bit faster, you can have a little bit of shake and you won't notice it, and it'll add to the effect of being there and being part of that video. However, if it's a slower movement and a more romantic moment in a wedding video, then maybe you need to slow that down and keep it nice and smooth on a gimbal. If you find yourself changing lenses a lot and you're changing focal lengths a lot, perhaps you're running prime lenses and you want to change between a 24 and a 50 and a 70 all the time, then you really, I think, need to consider what's most important to you. Because if you need to be changing your lens all the time and you're on a gimbal, that's added time that you have to rebalance your gimbal, which sometimes you don't always have at a wedding because you're going to miss moments happening. However, if you can do that handheld and you can quickly snap a lens on or off, that might be the best way. Ultimately, you need to remember though, a gimbal or a handheld camera rig, these are both just tools and techniques that are going to help you tell a story. And ultimately, telling the story in the best way you can is the most important thing. Any piece of gear, whether that be a drone or a gimbal or a slider, anything, these things are just tools at the end of the day, and none of them will substitute for telling a good story and an emotional wedding video that the couple and everyone else watching can really get emotionally invested in. So will I be making the switch to shooting handheld for all of my future weddings? I don't think so. There's definitely moments where I wish I would have the gimbal if I was going to do that, such as when the bride is walking down the aisle. I really definitely want that whole thing to be nice and smooth. But I will definitely try and use handheld shooting more than I currently do. I'm going to try and incorporate it into my videos a little bit more. And I'm going to try and shoot everything at a slightly lower frame rate, maybe 24 frames per second, and keep everything more real time, and trying to do that handheld. So I'm going to see how that progresses over the 2021 wedding season, and I will be sure to keep you updated on that and how it goes throughout the season. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you took something away from it. If you did, be sure to hit the thumbs up and to hit the subscribe button, and drop a comment to let me know whether you're shooting your next wedding handheld or with a gimbal. And once you've done all of that, I will see you in the next video.